this video, I'm going to show you how you can transform your landscape photography photos by tweaking the composition of your images. And as an amateur photographer myself, I know exactly how frustrating it can be to spend hours and hours out shooting, only to come home with mediocre shots that don't quite hit the mark. But after a literal ton of trial and error, I've discovered some key tips that really helped me up my composition game. So whether you are which is probably the case, a fellow amateur like me, or someone who just loves dreaming about capturing stunning landscapes, stick around because this video might just change the way that you approach your photography. First off, let's talk about what composition actually is. Think of it like arranging the furniture in your living room. You've got all the stuff there, you just want to arrange it to look good and for it to be nice and to be comfortable. Well, composition in photography is the same idea, but it's with the stuff that you see down your camera's viewfinder. It's not really about, and especially in landscape photography, it's not really about having the most expensive couch or the fanciest rug. It's about working with what you've got in front of you and making it look its best. So whether you're shooting out in your backyard or you're on top of a mountain, composition is really just about putting all the pieces together in a way that looks amazing. Now, there are countless elements of composition out there, but today I'm going to focus on 10 things that I think are the most important elements of composition for landscape photographers. All right, so let's kick things off with the first element, and that is points. And when I first heard about this one, I was like, points, what does that even mean? It's some kind of geometric thing. But trust me, points are a game changer in landscape photography. Basically, a point is any small area of interest in your frame, like a distant mountain peak or a tiny bird in the sky. The key is to use these points to draw your viewer's eye towards that area and add a little bit of visual intrigue to your shot. And what goes further than this? What drives our eyes towards the points in a scene? Lines. All right, let's talk about lines. And I know it might not sound very exciting, but trust me, lines are the superheroes of composition. Think of them as arrows that point your viewer's eyes towards where you want them to look in a photo. Imagine you're on a treasure hunt and the lines are the clues that lead you towards the prize. It could be a curvy road, a fence, or even the way the clouds are shaped. It doesn't have to be a literal straight line. It just to be something that draws the eye towards the focal point of the photo itself. And when you start to use lines in your photos, it's like giving the viewer of the photo a map. And this makes the photo more interesting and dynamic. And typically, I find that this is the difference between taking a photo of a scene, a snapshot, and making a photo of what you want the viewer to get, view, take away from the scene that you've put in front of them. So again, that's sort of the taking a photo, a snapshot versus making a photo. I find it's the lines and being conscious of what I want the viewer to look at that turns something from, all right, that was pretty, into, this is quite interesting. And speaking of things that make photos interesting, have you ever noticed how certain shapes tend to catch your eye? So moving on to shapes. I know I don't mean those weird geometric things you had to draw in your high school art classes. In photography, shapes are all about creating visual interest and balance in your frame. They can be anything from the obvious in landscape photography, like the sun, to something more abstract, like a triangular mountain range or a series of mountain ranges. The key is to look for shapes that complement each other and add a bit of dynamic energy to your shot. If you've got lots of shapes on one side of the frame, you probably want lots of shapes on the other side of the frame. If you have something very complicated at one point in the frame, you might have something slightly simpler on the other. Or if you have something big on one side, you might have something big on the other to balance it all out. The goal is to be conscious of the shapes that are in the frame and where they're positioned. But shapes aren't the only way to add depth and dimension to your photos. Let's talk about another one of my favorite elements, and this is texture. Texture is absolutely one of my favorite elements to play with because it adds so much depth and dimension to your photos. Think about a field of wildflowers or rough bark on an old tree. These textures draw you in. It makes you feel like you could reach out and touch the environment that the picture's been taken of. And as an amateur photographer, I'm always looking for ways to incorporate more texture into my shots. Whether it's through sticking a bunch of flowers in the foreground or even taking more photos in stormy and rainy conditions. So it's not just one clear view from the front to the back of the frame, there's more stuff going on in between. And do you know what can really make those textures pop? Color. All right, so let's move on to color. And I know this one sounds pretty obvious, right? But trust me, the way that you use color in your photos can make a huge difference to the overall mood and impact. One tip I've learned recently is to look for complementary colors like blue and orange or red and green. So it could be a red flower in the foreground with green fields in the background. When you pair these opposite hues together, it creates really striking contrast that makes your photos really pop. Another color tip that I swear by is to pay attention to the temperature of the light. Of course, you know that the light changes temperature throughout the day. It starts off golden, warm, and gets bluer, and then golden and warmer again. And trust me, this can massively change the vibe of your photos. It can be the difference between a cozy campfire and a spooky, foggy forest, when essentially the shot is exactly the same, and the composition is the same. And for us landscape photographers, when the sun is setting, everything gets warm. That golden glow is 9 times out of 10 what most people are after. And you can even use Photoshop and Lightroom to a certain extent to add more golden hues to what is not a very golden photo. I'll link to one of my photo editing videos below this one in the description so you can check that out. And speaking of setting the mood, let's talk about tone. Okay, so tone. And no, I don't mean your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend's terrible attitude. In photography, tone refers to the darkness, the brightness, and the contrast between those in your image. And the way that you leverage tone can completely and absolutely change the mood of your shot. Like a dark and moody forest scene is going to feel very different to a bright and airy beach landscape. And something that I'm experimenting and slightly obsessed with, if I'm being honest, in all my photography right now is dodging and burning. Basically, brightening and darkening specific parts of an image to draw attention to certain elements within it. It also adds dynamic range if you brighten the lights and darken the shadows. And it allows you to take your photograph that documented a scene and turn it into more of a piece of art. You can interpret the light, the shadows, where the sun was, the colors via dodging and burning. And the best way I've heard this described by a pro to me when I've been out on a workshop was that he considers the data that is captured on the sensor is your canvas. You get it onto your computer, you paint light, you move things around, you change the shape of things, you warp things, you manipulate it essentially, and that is the art. That is the art of photography there. Now, of course, if your photography is based around documentary work, or if you are taking photos of protests or something that needs to be accurate, we're not going to take this approach. But for landscape photography, still life photography, things like that, absolutely, I think this is an amazing way to think about things. The sensor is your canvas, you get your canvas on the computer, and you just go and have at it and build color, shape, design, whatever is in your head from an artistic perspective. And whilst we're on the subject of moving through the frame and directing people's eyeballs, let's talk about distance. All right, so moving on to the relationship side of things. First up, we have distance. And this one is all about the spacing between the subjects and the elements of your photo and how it affects the overall composition. For example, if you've got 2 mountains in your frame, the distance between them can create a sense of scale and grandeur. Or for example, if you're shooting a portrait, the distance between your subject and the background can create a sense of intimacy or isolation, depending on how blown out that background is. But distance isn't the only thing that affects the relationship between elements in your photo. Balance is another biggie. And balance can be where things start to get a little bit tricky, but stick with me. In photography, balance is all about the arrangement of visual weight of the elements within your frame so that everything feels stable and harmonious. If you've got something big on one side, probably you want something big on the other, unless you are documenting something that is inherently unstable, in which case you might want to accentuate the pull and the push or the weight or the distance of all these different elements to make it feel uncomfortable to the viewer. But for amateurs like me, right, think of it like playing Jenga. You want everything to feel like it's in the right place. We want anything feeling too tight or light or heavy. You want the stack of blocks to be, it doesn't have to be perfectly aligned. It can be some randomness in there, but overall you want it to stay standing. And one tip that I've learned that probably every amateur photographer should be leaning into is called the rule of thirds. Basically, imagine your frame has been divided into a 9-part grid. Try to place the main elements of your photograph on the lines or at the intersections. It's certainly not a hard and fast rule, but it's a good starting point for creating balance in your shots. And balance isn't just about where you place your subjects, it's also the space around them. Okay, so let's talk about space. I know obviously, I don't mean the final frontier. In photography, space is all about the interplay between positive and negative elements within your frame. Positive space is anything that draws the viewer's attention to it, like the main subject or a bright, bold color. Negative space is the filler around those elements. Think a real plain blue sky or a smooth expanse of water. The key here is not to even focus too much on the positive space. That'll kind of take care of itself. usually what amateur photographers like myself have to lean into and really understand and be conscious of is the negative space. You've got to use it intentionally. Don't just leave a huge part of your frame empty for the sake of it. Use it to create a sense of scale or to draw attention to the main part of your subject or to balance things out. A big bit of negative space will balance out a really sharp, important element on the other side of the frame. Or if you've got a subject or a person and they're looking one direction, use a large bit of negative space on that side of the frame so that it looks like they're looking into something, an expanse, an adventure. And don't be afraid to experiment with different ratios of positive negative space as well. A little bit of negative space allows the elements within your photograph to breathe, but it can also go a long way in creating a sense of mood and atmosphere. All right, so that's everything I've got for you in this video. If you want to continue taking your photography to the next level, why not click the video that's on the screen right now and jump right in.